Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Maclean's Live. I'm Paul Wells, senior writer at Maclean's Magazine, coming to you from Ottawa. Everyone else you're going to see tonight is coming to you broadly from the Washington, D.C. region, because we're talking about the U.S. elections. It's 2 weeks before one of the most consequential presidential elections of our lifetime, and I figured I would bring you a bunch of people who know more about all of that than I do. We also have two segments tonight. We're getting really sophisticated. In the second part of tonight's show, I'm going to bring you an interview with Carlos Lozada, a book critic at the Washington Post, whose new book is What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. Carlos took it upon himself to read 150 books about America in the Trump years, and then he wrote a book about what it's like to read all those Trump books. And we're going to bring him here to you later. But in the meantime, and also, I should say, as always, thanks to our sponsors at the Canadian Bankers Association, who bring all of these conversations to you, and we're always grateful for that. Tonight, we have three experienced specialists and analysts of the American political scene. Let me start with Maryscott Greenwood. Scotty is the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council, a lifelong Democrat, and probably every Canadian's favorite Georgian. She's coming to us from Virginia. Where are you at, Scotty?
Arlington, Virginia.
Arlington,
Thanks,
Virginia.
And the CABC is nonpartisan. So you outed me as a Democrat, which everybody knows, but my organization is nonpartisan. So I just have to put in that disclaimer.
I will say right off that when Donald Trump got elected, you were very good at explaining to me all the great things that a Trump presidency would do for Canadian-U.S. relations. So you take your nonpartisanship seriously. Eugene Daniels is a reporter for Politico and the host of Politico's panel show Foursquare. And so he's very used to the format that you see right now, four faces on a screen. He's going to help me get through it. Eugene, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I think this is my first Canadian event. I'm very excited.
Can you smell the maple or can you taste it yet? Because it's amazing.
Vote, all of it. Yes.
Yeah, we're going to ask you how to say about, and then.
Then we get knocked off if we say it wrong.
And EJ Dionne is a columnist for the Washington Post and still a fellow of the Brookings Institution.
Yep.
And wears so many hats, but you know him from the Washington Post and from a lot of the U.S. political shows. EJ and I go back. We were just talking earlier about how in 2000, during the primary season in South Carolina, he and I had shrimp and grits together, and we've been staying in touch ever since. So it's really good to have you join us, EJ.
Could I say what a joy it is to be here? And I am really grateful to you and Maclean's who keep me up to date on Canadian politics, because I am one American, and you can tell perhaps by my last name, I'm one American who really loves Canadian politics, and I get a real kick of seeing that political newsletter pop up on my phone. So thank you very much. I still want you back on Twitter, Paul, even though I admire your decision to quit. I miss you.
I think if we were to take a poll, we would still find more people who are happy that I left Twitter than people who want me back.
I really miss you. I always loved seeing what you were up to.
Okay, so we're going to take about a half hour talking about all of this. Let's just call things by their name, and I'll put this, I guess, to you first, Eugene. Is this election done? Is this baked in? Is Donald Trump's presidency about to end?
2016 has, I think, rightly taught us all to be very careful about predictions like that, as we have a Trump presidency right now. But I think the thing that's different than it was in 2016 are a couple of things. The polling that has started to happen in swing states and battleground states, it's much more robust. There's been a lot more resources added to that. So we're getting a better picture of what these states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, Florida, what they might actually look like come November 3rd or after, depending on how long it takes to count all the votes. And also fundraising, right? Like his campaign isn't broke, right? However, they don't have as much money as they need to running into this. And this year you have the way that President Trump has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. Most Americans don't think he handled it well. Even when you talk to Republicans, they wish he would have done things differently, right? He's downplayed the pandemic, something that he admitted to Bob Woodward, and we all heard that recording that kind of took over the news cycle for a while. So it's not baked, but it does seem at this point, when you talk to people behind the scenes, Republicans, and also people that work for Trump's campaign, and even in the administration, they are having a hard time seeing a path to victory, which is something that wasn't the case in 2016, right? They were kind of thinking like, hey, we might win this thing, and you're hearing that less and less. And Republicans writ large, when you talk to congressional Republicans behind the scenes, they're even distancing themselves from President Trump in many ways. You started seeing that this week. You heard Senator Ben Sasse kind of talking on a call with constituents, which he kind of probably knew was going to come out, and hitting the president in a way that he hadn't hit him before. So I think you're starting to see signs that everyone's assuming there will be a President Biden come January 20 in 2021. But again, anything could change, and 2020 has shown us that out of all the how 2020 has worked.
Scotty Greenwood, what's your takeaway from the campaign so far, and what are you looking for in the closing weeks?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't, they say stick a fork in it, it's done. I wouldn't get the fork out yet. It's notwithstanding the national polls, which have Biden with a, 10 or 11 point lead, today. When you look at the states that are going to matter, the swing states, if you will, the close states, it's close. It's within the margin of error. Florida is tied. North Carolina is tied. It's close in Wisconsin. And it's closer than the Biden campaign would like it to be in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan. So it's not done yet. But to answer your question directly, Paul, I'm watching not only the presidential race, but also the Senate races. Whether or not the Senate changes from Republican control to Democratic control is quite consequential. And it's something that, in a parliamentary democracy like you have, if you've got a majority government, you run the table. In our system, it's divided government, right? It's divided separation of powers, as we call it. So the Senate, any individual, even minority United States senator, has an awful lot of power, can stop the gears of government from going forward. So, but it does matter. So I'm watching the Senate as well. I agree with what you said at the top, that this is a enormously consequential election. And the thing is, we're already voting. Millions of Americans have already cast their ballots. Voting is happening now. So November 3rd represents the last day you can vote. It doesn't represent the last day that votes will be counted, though. So unless we have an overwhelming tide, I think there's some chance that we won't know. You mentioned 2000. Eating shrimp and grits. I'm hungry now, so thanks for that. But it could take a while. The other thing I will just say, just to wrap this little part, is, if the Electoral College is a tie, so let's say you could even imagine Biden winning the popular vote the way Hillary did, but the Electoral College would be tied. It then goes, the system is, it goes to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation gets one vote. So you need 26 votes in the House to win. And the way the House of Representatives is now, you could have Biden winning the popular vote by a lot. You could have the Electoral College tied. It then goes to the House, and there's a scenario where Trump then wins in the House, depending on how a couple of House seats go, if they flip from Republican to Democrat or the other way. So I'm watching the Senate and I'm watching the House, because this is going to be a really interesting and unfortunately longer than we hope process, I believe.
EJ, it sounds like we're describing a process that could be quite a nail biter, and I'm not looking forward to that, because after the last 4 years, I'm out of nails. Have you ever seen an election like this?
Yeah, I agree basically with everything Eugene and Scotty said. I think if you go to pundits in the United States right now, there are two kinds of pundits. Kind one says Biden's pretty well gutted. It could even be a landslide, which you can take from the polls. The second kind of pundit says, but what about 2016? And what happened to Hillary? And all debates about how to read the polls right now are conditioned by that argument. And that if you look at how many states are in play, that if you are Donald Trump, you don't want to see in play, it's really troublesome for him, because you not only have the three key states that won it for him, where Biden has some kind of lead at this moment, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but you've got Biden competitive or ahead in Florida, in North Carolina, in Arizona, He seems to have a real shot in Ohio. On election night, it is conceivable from the data we are looking at right now that all these states fall to Biden. However, in a lot of these, the polls are very close, and it would take only a few points to flip it back. So if I am more in the first group than the second group, but if I may channel my sense of the second group, it seems to me the state through which either a Trump victory or the road to chaos goes through is Pennsylvania. That it is conceivable that Biden would win Wisconsin and Michigan, lose the rest of what he lost the last time, and then Pennsylvania is very contested. And the problem with Pennsylvania, I think it was the New York Times, it may have been my paper, the Washington Post, had a list of the 7 states, close states, where you may have the most electoral trouble. And Pennsylvania is at the top of the list because it's all tangled up in litigation. If Pennsylvania gets contested, that's when we have this crisis. But the line between that outcome and a pretty sweeping Biden victory is very, very thin at the moment. And I think the big differences are that there is less hostility to Joe Biden than there was to Hillary Clinton. You can argue, I would argue, that's unfair to Hillary Clinton in many ways, but that's a reality of American political life. More people are, the last time a lot of Trump's vote was an anti-Clinton vote. You don't have as much of an anti-Biden vote. And you have 4 years of Donald Trump as president. So he is not a blank slate on which people can project their anger. He is a president who is widely seen, even by many Republicans, as failing in the COVID crisis. So bottom line, if this election stays focused on the pandemic, Joe Biden could well win that big victory. Trump's job in the last 2 weeks is to do anything possible to shift the focus. And I think that's what you're going to see in the debate.
Yeah, and EJ, one of the things that is caused the biggest problem, I think, is that President Trump got COVID, right? Like the media had started to talk about a lot of different things, right? Talking about unrest in a lot of these big cities. And then the president of the United States, after traveling and being around a bunch of people, go having huge rallies, some outside, some inside, largely without masks, he got COVID and so did a lot of other people. His wife, some of his top advisors, some of his top military leaders had to go home and quarantine for 2 weeks so as to not give it to anyone, or if they did indeed have it. So I think that is the reason why he's going to have a very hard time in these next 2 weeks changing the narrative to anything other than the pandemic, because he got COVID-19.
I couldn't agree more. I think that really was deeply important in pulling the whole conversation back. And the other thing is, I think, and I'm curious what Scotty and Eugene think, Trump has had 2 big opportunities to change the conversation, and he didn't use them well. One were the convention time, where the net effect of the 2 conventions was not particularly positive for Trump. It wasn't all that negative, but it certainly, he needed to change the conversation, and he didn't. And the other was the first debate, which turned out to be a catastrophe for him, or at least a big problem for him, that his way of debating or not debating or yelling or whatever that thing was that he did turned out to push more people away than attract them. And so, I think this debate on Thursday is one thing. And then the other thing I think about a lot is Comey's letter won the election for Trump the last time. I think there's a lot of data that suggests that. Hillary was ahead by 5.8 or 9 before the Comey letter. A week later, she was down to 2.9. She won the popular vote by 2.1% and lost those key states. So I'm looking for what is the event, what can be thrown out there in the last 2 weeks that'll change this conversation. And I can't figure out yet what the heck that is. And maybe it's not there.
That story in the New York Post about an abandoned laptop that turned out to have stuff that was potentially incriminating to Hunter Biden and therefore to Joe Biden looked like that October surprise, but it seems to be a bit of a damp squib. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere.
Well, that's another change that has occurred from 2016 to now, in addition to everything Eugene said. But, the Russian interference and the idea that these social media platforms can be levered for a political outcome without being fact checked or whatever is something that people are really worried about. So it's still possible to affect people's point of view and opinion, but there's much more weariness about it, and the platforms themselves are trying to be careful about it. So I think the opportunity for a completely false or a mostly false or a partially false event to occur that would really change people's minds is different. The other thing I would say is the amount of people who haven't made up their mind at this point in the race is much smaller. So, 4 years ago, I think it was 15 or 20% that were still potentially available to be persuaded by the final debate or by some news or whatever. This time it's like around 5%. So there just aren't that many people that would be willing to change their mind. The question becomes who is able to get their voters to show up more enthusiastically, to endure long lines. And I think there's some evidence that supporters on both sides, and I would say, well, it's really the pro-Trump vote and the anti-Trump vote. I think Biden is kind of a placeholder for the anti-Trump vote. And I agree with EJ, there's not anti-Biden sentiment the way there was anti-Hillary sentiment, but there is anti-Kamala sentiment, right? I mean, there are a number of people that I've talked to that said, well, Biden's old and I really don't want, that lady to be president. And that's what I'm basing my vote on. You saw David Perdue in Georgia, in a very offensive way, mocking her as if he didn't know how to pronounce her name, even though he's served with her in the United States Senate since 2017. It's just kind of outrageous. So there isn't an anti-Biden vote, but you do have both enthusiasm for Kamala, lots of it, but you also have that layer just under the surface of people that are motivated to keep her back.
Can I build on that for a sec? Because
Sure.
I think those are all key points. Number one, in terms of enthusiasm, the anti-Trump enthusiasm is strong and real. And in the early voting so far, the Democrats are running very well in terms of who is choosing to get their ballots. I have my ballot right here on my desk. And
Go vote, EJ.
But I'm going to drop it in my Dropbox this week. And I think Trump in the end couldn't regret his attack on mail voting, because historically Republicans were very good at turning out voters through the mail, getting their people to vote absentee. And he has discouraged them from doing that. And this is going to be a hard election to vote in because of the pandemic. The lines are going to be very complicated by social distancing measures. So that's number one. Number two, the double haters vote, as the pollsters like to call it, people who hate both candidates, the double haters elected Donald Trump the last time. In the exit poll, 17% of all Americans told the exit pollsters that they had a negative view of Trump and a negative view of Clinton. Those 17% voted 47-30 for Trump. The rest voted third party. Ballgame. That's won him the election. That accounted for about 9% of his 46%. This time, the double haters are much a smaller group, but they're going to Biden, not surprisingly, because they're now voting against the incumbent. So that is a very different thing happening. The Republicans are desperate to run against Kamala Harris, and I think they're going to try to escalate that. And that's why I think she did it, and I'm curious what you guys think. She did a very good job in the debate, because she managed to be aggressive enough attacking Trump, but it was very restrained, and she looked very potentially presidential. She played into none of the tropes, I thought, that Republicans are trying to invent to go after her. So far, I think she's been quite effective. I'm curious if you guys see it the same way.
Maybe I could jump in and say there's.
Really, Paul?
I think there's.
Never. He never expresses a view, this gentleman.
No, I'm enjoying having a quiet session, just letting y'all talk. But I think it's fair to say that Trump in 2016, he was a bunch of things, but he was canny and clear-eyed and strategic, and he pursued an obvious strategy that paid off for him. This year, that seems to be much less the case. He seems to be kind of all over the map. How about the other guy? Has Joe Biden run a good campaign, or is he just benefiting from being the person running against Trump now that we know what kind of president Trump has been? Eugene?
I think it depends on how you would measure a good campaign, right? At this point, his campaign is raising millions and millions of dollars, breaking records. He has more money in the bank and in his coffers than President Trump does, right? So that would be kind of like one of the key indicators that someone has run a good campaign. He has had his own gaffes throughout, right? Like, he is also very gaffe prone. That's why you talked to a lot of Democrats before that first debate. They were a little bit concerned at how, it was just going to be gaffe city, but because of the way that President Trump acted, he was the one, that continued to interrupt, that continued to, according to his advisors, do what he wanted to do, which was dominate the conversation, but ended up having the opposite effect. But Joe Biden has had gaffes throughout this entire process. And, a lot of them actually that have kind of hit the mainstream, dealing with race. You know what I mean? When he talked about, if you don't vote for me, if you're having trouble deciding between me and Donald Trump, you ain't black, which Republicans tried to use against him. He has had a hard time at this point. Still, he doesn't talk about it and probably doesn't get asked about it anymore. The 1994 crime bill, right, which he was an author of, that is to blame, a lot of people say in this country, for the over-incarceration of African Americans. But what's interesting is in 2016, Trump was kind of Teflon Don, right? Everything that happened kind of bounced off of him. It kind of seems that way with Joe Biden this time around. I think largely that has to do with the fact that, like everyone's been saying, the anti-Trump sentiment feels so strong in both polling and when you go out, and when we could, and now we have to Zoom voters and call them that way. But talking to voters, they say the same thing, right? This is no longer about what could President Trump do, right? Like, the American people have had 4 years of what he could do. And any president that was handed the hand that President Trump was handed this year, a pandemic that has killed more than, nearly 220,000 Americans or people here in this country, millions having it, an economy that was in free fall and is is steadily, slowly coming back, and anti-racism protests that happen. Any one of those things for any president is hard to deal with. Donald Trump got all of those at the same time. And his handling of those has been seen by a lot of people as not, it hasn't been a good thing. So that's what's feeding the anti-Trump sentiment, is that people are seeing with their own eyes, one, because we're stuck at home, with their own eyes, they're having to face all of the things that's happening in this country. And I think, when you talk to voters about all of the issues they care about and those major issues, sometimes Trump wins on the economy. But usually people trust Joe Biden to bring us together. And I think after 4 years of Trump, that's what a lot of Democrats want. That's what some Republicans want who will be voting for Joe Biden. And that's also what some of the independents want. It just, is it enough to take him over the finish line?
I think Biden's campaign is underrated. And I think he is running it's almost a Paul Wells get the basics right campaign. I think it's the kind of thing you look for in a campaign. Real quick, bring your party together. He negotiated really well with Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, gave progressives stuff that's popular with voters without altering his fundamental positions. He's handled that very well too. Don't get in the way of your opponent when he is destroying himself. And all the talk about Biden in the basement, that was a magical basement that he was in, because in the period that he was off the trail, Trump was causing all kinds of trouble for himself. Biden didn't get in the way. Third, identify the swing voters on the other side that you can pull over. He's done a really good job, and we'll see if it pays off in the end, at really going after the parts of the Trump constituency that could be pulled away. A certain number of white working class voters who think Trump hasn't really delivered for them, and he's really been very aggressive about that. And also, obviously, the suburban voters who respond on competence. And lastly, make sure your base turns out to vote. I think picking Harris was a good idea. He has been very clear in remembering that it was African Americans in South Carolina who pushed him over the line. That's a pretty good 4-part get the basics right strategy, I think.
Well, can I just jump in on that, just on the one question? Paul, you're never going to get a word in edgewise. I don't know what you were thinking with
I don't
this
mind.
panel.
Yeah, that's okay.
But on the question of whether Biden's running a great campaign, you have to give credit to the candidate, of course. You also have to look at his very talented team of professionals. And Jen O'Malley Dillon, his campaign manager, knows a little something about Canada, by the way. I think she was a consultant to Justin Trudeau previously, but he's got a team of professionals that are both from the Obama-Biden era, but also from his years in the Senate. Ron Maclean. I mean, we could go through the list of really smart, talented people. EJ's right. He's also brought in the new coalition of Democrats that are important. But he also, I have to say, has benefited from something that is not directed by him. But look at the Lincoln Project. If you haven't seen the ads for the Lincoln Project, Google them because they are devastating. The Lincoln Project is a group of national security-minded Republicans that can't tolerate Donald Trump anymore. And some of their advertising has been, or their communications have been the most effective in this cycle, in my opinion. And it's moving the people who just can't stomach Donald Trump for various reasons. When Trump, went after military people when he was in Europe as suckers and losers, there are a lot of military families in the United States, and there are a lot of Republican-leaning military families, and they're all gone. And it wasn't just the one comment, but then you have the Lincoln Project reminding people that I'll just give you one anecdote. My oldest brother is a United States Marine. And so I get a lot of Marine, and my dad was a Marine, my brother-in-law, I'm from a Marine Corps family. So Semper Fi, hoorah, My brother sends me all this stuff all the time, including this huge banner in Arizona, by the way, which is a place where, in play, interesting, but it's a huge Marine Corps banner. It's burgundy and gold. It's got the Marine Corps emblem on it, and it says 4 generations of suckers and losers for Joe Biden. So anyway, that's thanks to the advocacy and the communications reach of the Lincoln Project.
Sometimes it has seemed, so the reason I'm being so quiet, first of all, is because I have to, but also because y'all keep answering the question I was going to ask. I was going to ask, Scotty, are there campaign strategists in the tradition of Carville and Begala and Karl Rove, and you gave me all the names. But it has seemed sometimes like Joe Biden benefits from stronger support among Republicans than among the Democratic base. The Democratic Party, Eugene, I think, is to the left of where it was in 2016, to the left of Joe Biden. Can he count on that party base and those party factions to have his back if he becomes president?
The thing that's really important to remember, and when we talk about like the base of the Democratic Party, it is Black people. So he can count on Black people. They have proven they are the reason he is the nominee of the Democratic Party at this point, right? But when you talk about those factions, right, you're talking about kind of the people who really like AOC, maybe we're supporting Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren in the primary. I think, and I've done some reporting on this, so I know how they're feeling, in a way that's actually really surprising. A critique that people often throw on the Democratic Party is that they're kind of all over the place, right? And it's a bigger tent party, right? It's more diverse. So there's a lot more thoughts and things and feelings in the party. And so the left of the party has professionalized and kind of focused in a way that they haven't, and they did not in 2016. They are ready to vote for, the ones you talk to, they say they're ready to vote for Joe Biden. They aren't happy about it. It's kind of like in 2016 when the mainstream Republicans held their nose and voted for President Trump. Is kind of what we're seeing. But what they're also doing is changing the way that they operate, right? There's I reported on a group that is going to focus on the Senate, which Democrats have not really done that much. They focus on the House a lot more. And adding money there. And so what they're hoping to do is have a Joe Biden presidency, a Kamala Harris as vice presidency, and annoy the heck out of them to move further to the left and to do more things that the left of the party and those factions want to do. So if he's president, it doesn't, it doesn't matter if they like him, right? Like, he's there. And so the job of the organizers, the job of the people on the left, they see it, is to push him as far as they possibly can. And what's interesting is that that's exactly what has happened on the right? There has been a rightward shift in the thinking of that party. The right has taken over that party, and the left is hoping to do that as well. They're also stealing some of the ideas of the way the right has done it, because the right has been ruthless in taking over the Republican Party.
Could I say, I see it just a little, maybe a bit more optimistically. First, just to add to the names, I think it's very important that Biden has actually managed to pull together new and old. Because old advisors like Mike Donnell and Steve Ricchetti, Cynthia Hogan have been really important to this. And, Mike Donnell is, I think, as far as I can tell, has done a fair amount of the advertising. And somehow this hasn't blown up. It's actually worked so far, this marriage of the new and the old. I'm somewhat more optimistic about the left and the Biden wing working together for the following reason. When he takes over, the country is going to be in the soup. It's in the soup with the virus. It's in the soup economically. And I think there's going to be a shared belief that an awful lot is going to have to be done, which will involve spending a lot of money, because that's what needs to happen in a Keynesian way. And that brings together left and center. There are plenty of business people right now who want a lot of stimulus into the economy. That's not as divisive as it would be, as even it probably was when Obama took over. Secondly, I do think there are ways forward where Biden can square the difference on healthcare, for example, where the public option and lowering the Medicare eligibility age, that's a huge step forward. I think there are other areas where Biden can take steps forward. Now, I agree with Eugene. There will be these fights in the party. And a PRI poll showed about half the party wanted a moderate candidate and half the party wanted Bernie or Elizabeth Warren. But only about a quarter of the Warren-Bernie people think that Biden is too conservative. So I see a party divided into three parts, sort of about half Biden, the other half left, but some of it very progressive, some of it more center-left. I think it's, in principle, a manageable coalition. We will reconvene 6 months after Biden wins, if he does, and we can see if it's all out warfare, and then I will bow to Eugene's wisdom, or they passed a lot of stuff, and we'll see.
And I will bow to yours.
Actually, that's a pretty good idea. Let's do this again. I do want to ask about another element of a Biden presidency, a hypothetical still Biden presidency, which is what kind of foreign policy president he would be. And Scotty, what kind of Canada-US president he would be. This would be the first time in a while that the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President have come from the same political family. Is there opportunity there?
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, in terms of foreign policy, if Biden is elected, a Biden presidency would remove a whole bunch of the cliffhangers and tension and anxiety about things like punitive tariffs. Like, there's no more, I'm going to threaten you with steel and aluminum tariffs or other tariffs. So that all gets diffused immediately. So big kind of sigh of relief. And you get back into, kind of regular order of engagement with multilateral institutions, with our allies, et cetera. In terms of Canada-US, that sigh of relief is going to be real and it's going to be meaningful. But it's not, there will be issues that need to be worked through that are of concern in the business community and for the economy as a whole between Canada and the United States. So, for example, there everywhere around the world, including here in North America, there is an instinct in sort of pandemic, post-pandemic, to try to reshore and have self-sufficiency, right? And to compete against each other, to make sure we have enough PPE, personal protective equipment, or we have enough ventilators or whatever we need, and we'll do it ourselves. That's an anathema to the way North America runs. So we got to make sure that Canada and the United States are in it together. So that's a piece, and that's not just American, but that'll be a challenge. The other thing is, we have had Buy American provisions of every infrastructure bill and lots of U.S. programs going back for generations. But Biden will take that to a whole new level. So the question will then be, okay, so once you buy as much American stuff as you can, if you can't source that giant crane you need to build the port in Savannah, Georgia, except from somewhere else, can you get the exemption? And so Canada will have to look at, does Buy American mean Buy North American, or does it mean something else? And that will be a challenge. But it'll be a challenge that is taken in the spirit of, we love our friends again. And so, the thing that's been so disorienting for world leaders and for other communities around the world is they sort of thought they could count on friendship with the U.S. And that the U.S. would go after its adversaries, and it feels upside down in a Trump world. So it'll be back right side up, I think.
But I just say
Absolutely.
It shows how much the United States loves Canada, that even Donald Trump couldn't destroy Canadian-U.S. relations. I mean, in other words, that
he's trying awfully hard, EJ.
What I wanted to say real quick, I broadly agree with all of that. I think Biden will be more multilateral. He will rebuild alliances, go back into try to redo the Iran deal if it can be done, go back into the World Health Organization, go back into the Paris Climate Initiative. I think the interesting question will be, where does his China policy go? Because his critique of Trump has not been Trump is too tough on China. It's that he's been incompetently tough on China. And there's a very interesting piece by Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan that ran in Foreign Affairs, I think is an important clue to this, where it'll be tougher on China than the Obama policy was, than Joe Biden was in the past, with a recognition that there are some issues U.S. and China have to work on, but it's got to be done in cooperation with allies. But I think the most interesting thing in play will be exactly what does Biden's China policy look like.
Okay. We could go on all night, although I kind of like the idea of reconvening our American political panel again once we have a post-election environment to discuss. For now, though, I want to thank all of you for your insights. I think we had a really good conversation. Eugene Daniels from Politico, Scotty, Greenwood from the Canadian American Business Council, EJ Dionne from the Washington Post. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
That went by like that. That was too quick, Paul. We got to get back.
And people should stay for Carlos's book, because he is amazing. So it's a great idea to have him on.
And indeed, stick around, because in our next segment, we've got Carlos Lozada, who read 150 books about Trump's America, so you don't have to. Thanks very much. Finally tonight, I wanted you to meet Carlos Lozada at a time when we're understandably all looking forward to what's about to happen in the United States. There are still a lot of people trying to come to terms with what just happened. And in that struggle, Carlos Lozada has made a kind of a heroic contribution. His new book is called What We Were Thinking. What Were We Thinking? A brief intellectual history of the Trump era. It's out on Simon & Schuster. You can get it now. And for that book, Carlos Lozada, who is a nonfiction book reviewer on the staff of the Washington Post, read 150 books about America in the Trump era. And he's boiled all of that down, and he's analyzed and classified basically the intellectual history of America in the Trump years. So Carlos, thank you for joining us, first of all.
Thanks for having me.
Secondly, thank you for jumping on that grenade for us and reading all of those books. What were you thinking?
Well, it sort of started accidentally. When Trump launched his campaign, I decided to read some of his old memoirs to try to get a sense of the man and of the candidate. Then once he began winning primaries, I started reading books about his supporters and the white working class. Then once he won, there were books about the resistance. And suddenly I realized this was going to be my beat. This became what I have done now for the past 4 years for the Washington Post and in this book.
Have you been able to read other stuff? I mean, 150 books is a lot, even over 4 years.
Yes, I tried to sneak in some completely non-political, non-Trump, often fiction writing in between all the books that I read on politics, and it's a nice way to kind of just get my mind away from it all. So I'd say that for every 4 political books, I'm able to sneak in maybe one novel or essay collection just for fun.
Boy, it must come as a relief. Now, there are so many books, not only strictly speaking about the Trump presidency, but also about sort of cultural looks at the divisions in American society and so on, that you break them down thematically by chapters. There's a chapter on the Never Trumpers, the Republicans who decided they can't support this guy. There's a chapter on the southern border and immigrants and the Mexican wall. There's a chapter on the Me Too movement, on Black Lives Matter, and so on and so on. And you also read a lot of stuff by Trump's defenders and allies. And you're broadly critical of just about everyone. If I can sum up your argument, it's that all of these books don't just point up the faults and failings and weaknesses of Donald Trump, but they point up fault lines in American culture right now.
I think that's the right way to interpret it. One thing I realized when reading these books is that they reflect the divisions that Donald Trump simply capitalized on to win the presidency. Often we think of Trump as this kind of prime mover of all of this, and a lot of the books that I read, focus obsessively on him. But I found that the most useful books for me were those that were less about Trump and more about how these fights over immigration or over identity, over who really belongs in the American story, are ever present and are not sort of an oddity or an outlier in the American experience, but they're basically its definition.
Is it fair to say, it's hard to generalize about all this, but is it fair to say that when somebody who doesn't read books gets elected to high office, people who write books take it poorly?
Perhaps. I think certainly that's been a constant refrain of the Trump era. People, this is a president who prefers to hang out on Twitter and watch cable news. And it's one of the ironies of the time that he has inspired this onslaught of book-length writing about his presidency. A lot of people worry or sort of do take it personally that Trump should read more. He should care more. His predecessor in office famously is a voracious reader. Releases his annual reading list of everything that he's focusing on. I'd be satisfied if Trump would read his briefing materials, his intelligence briefings. That would be plenty for me.
Your book's often quite cutting. You talk in passing about this book, A Warning, by an anonymous, a person who presents themselves as a senior Trump administration official, who wrote anonymously that the guy's a jerk and a loser and it's awful and so on. And you point out that this person, along with their associates, had often thought about quitting, but never seemed to get around to it. And you say the book is sort of like profiles in thinking about courage.
Yes.
I get the impression a lot of these books came to you as a bit of a letdown.
I think that book in particular did, because it is by, ostensibly, and I have no reason to not believe this, that it is by a senior administration official who presumably was in position to tell us quite a bit about what he or she saw in the White House. But usually anonymity is granted in journalism in order to obtain more information. In this case, anonymity justifies giving less information because the author is so concerned about preserving that anonymity that there's very few sort of identifying moments or details that could tell us something that we didn't already know. And so instead we get this sort of very broad brush criticism of the president that is consistent with criticisms of the president that are made every day. And that said, I think that you do have a lot of officials who leave the White House or who are ejected from the White House, who then end up telling us about, oh boy, I really had a lot of concerns while I was in there, but didn't necessarily reveal those things when that information could have been most useful.
And I think the strongest contrast with a book like A Warning is maybe the book that Timothy Snyder wrote, the historian Timothy Snyder, called On Tyranny, which you listed among 13 of your sort of favorite Trump era books at the end. And I think there's two things that surprised me about your account of that book. One is that it's a strong defense of institutions. So much of this debate is about personalities, but Snyder reminds us that institutions matter and that people have to play their sort of formal role or everything crumbles. And the other thing is that it's a call to introspection and to people to ask themselves, have I met my own standards, instead of playing a blame game?
Yes, that kind of book I found especially valuable in this time. There's some books that I have to read and review so many books that there's some that I look on my shelf and I years later and I can't even remember that I had read, and written about. Snyder's is the kind of book that I remember where I was. I remember what the weather was like. I remember how I felt when I read that book. It came so early in the Trump presidency, and so it was less just about kind of whining about Trump and more about really anticipating what some of the challenges could be. And one of those was, of course, the erosion of institutions in civic life. And so, and he draws, of course, as a historian on the experiences of, interwar Germany, of other kind of key periods where you see that the power of individual leaders ends up eroding the power of institutions. And there have been other books that hit at that as well. One that Snyder's came at the beginning of the Trump presidency. Yuval Levin's book, A Time to Build, is also about the power of institutions, and that came towards the end of this presidential term. And his concern is that our institutions are becoming more performative than formative, and really their formative job is essential. The institutions help remind us how we're supposed to act in key moments, and precisely when things seem the most out of whack is when we need to hew most closely to those institutional norms.
I'm wondering, probably there hasn't been a modern president who's provoked such an outburst of writing and agitated thinking and debate as Donald Trump. How necessary to this whole debate and to this historical moment is Donald Trump? How much of what America is going through right now would it be going through if he hadn't become president? Can we engage in a bit of alternative history?
In some ways, Trump simplifies the debate because so much of it becomes this simplistic binary. Like you're with Trump or you're against him. You're the anti-Trump resistance or you're the pro-Trump base. And it's almost like there's no room in between. And of course, that's a really simplistic way to look at it. I imagine that in a post-Trump era, whether that is in 3 months or in 4 years, the debates over policy, over identity, over belonging are only going to get more complicated, not less, without him, because the focus on him, which is reflected in many of these books, makes it seem like all this came out of nowhere, and he's just the person who kind of propelled this. Whereas, of course, the forces that even allowed Trump to be close to the presidency were ones that long predate him and that will probably far outlast him.
I don't want to jinx the result of the election on November 3rd, but say hypothetically Donald Trump were not the president after November 3rd. Mm-hmm. Would you miss him? He's been in your every waking moment, it seems, for 4 years.
I think as a book critic, I would be happy to move on to other things. That said, I think whatever the result is in November, and whoever the president is after Inauguration Day in January, we're going to have Trump and in American political life for a long time, and we will have Trump books for a long time. There are going to be many more memoirs that are going to come out from key officials that I look forward to reading. I wanna know what they have to say about this period, whether it's Kirstjen Nielsen, who ran Homeland Security, or Anthony Fauci now during the COVID pandemic. And there will continue to be, as new investigations are launched, new documents are declassified. We're going to be learning more and excavating this period for a long time to come. So whether I miss him or not, I think will be irrelevant, because he's not going to go away.
Well, for as long as he continues to bedevil the rest of us, we're going to need guidebooks to understand Trump's America. And yours was a tremendously entertaining and thought-provoking one. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Carlos Lozada is a nonfiction book critic for the Washington Post, and he's the author of What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era, out now on Simon & Schuster. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up here tonight. I want to thank everyone at home for joining us. And as always, I want to thank our sponsors at the Canadian Bankers Association for making these conversations possible. I'm Paul Wells. Thanks very much. Good night.